Is there a fatherless book, an orphan volume in this world? A book that is not the descendant of other books? A single leaf of a book that is not an offshoot of the great genealogical tree of mankind's literary imagination? Is there creation without tradition? But again, can tradition survive without renewal, a new creation, a new greening of the perennial tale? Hi, this is Eric.
Hey, this is Nick.
And this is David, and welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast. On this episode, we are continuing our discussion of Carlos Fuentes, and we have read an article or an essay that he wrote. It pretty much breaks down how he wrote Aura. And what this article's main purpose is, I think, is to show how influence is an essential part of creativity. So Fuentes has this sort of through line of influence from his own personal history in Paris, referencing 16th century poet Quevedo, pardon my pronunciation. He talks about filmmakers Buñuel and Mizoguchi, classic novels from Henry James, Pushkin, and Dickens, and he sort of traces the sort of strange Gothic feel all the way back into Chinese mythical tales. So my question is, and I'll start with Eric, one, did you catch any of these references? Does it spark anything in your mind thinking back on Aura? And if it did, or even if it didn't, how does that influence your perception of the book now?
Well, I would say first, these specific references that he mentions in the essay, I don't think any of these came to mind when I was initially reading the book, although certainly Aura did hark back to other things that I think I knew about, whether that we talked about last week, whether it's just the Gothic tale genre in general, or we talked a little bit about Edgar Allan Poe. Certainly that came to mind. And so, no, I didn't get any of these allusions, but I don't think that's a bad thing necessarily. And, when I think about first of all, I really love this essay, and I think the essay in some ways is using this deconstruction of Aura, the story on the surface, as a bit of a Trojan horse to really talk about, creativity and how the act of creation happens. And, I would argue that I don't think Fuentes thought that many people would have, made connections to these specific things. I think he's making a bigger point about how creativity is always this, accumulation of influences that you put through your own personal filter to create something new. And that's the key, right? Is that you as the creator take these influences and transform them into something wholly new. And I've always told my students this. It's like, look, you don't just want to take something and just, recycle it exactly the way it was. The idea is that you take this influence. You shouldn't be afraid of the influence. But if you're really sort of a creator of intent, you are unconsciously going to transform it because it's you that's unique. I always tell students, don't worry about making it new, making it yours. And I think that's what Fuentes is really talking about here.
Because in making it yours, it is new in some way.
Exactly.
Yeah, and he's got this quote on it that basically lays that out perfectly, where he says, originality is the sickness of a modernity that wishes to see itself as something new, always new, in order to continually witness its own birth. In doing so, modernity is the fashionable illusion which only speaks to death. And so he's basically, laying out that this whole idea of creating something original is just a total fallacy. And him working through all of these illusions and influences is, his way of, at first it kind of comes across as like, wow, like this very simple story that you wrote that last podcast we were talking about as kind of pure entertainment in a way is actually a reference to all of this stuff dating back to the 16th century. And it's kind of like, well, that's actually seemed a little over the top. But after I kind of read this twice, I was like, I get it. I see where you're pulling this. And to me, I always like tie it back to music. And like when people write music, like whether or not they want to acknowledge it, it's pretty much just always referencing the riffs of bands that have like seeped into their own influence. And so I think this is a way of Fuentes just admitting that and doing so in a very poetic, intellectual manner.
Yeah. I think we got to the crux of what he's doing, and all three of us seem to like how he does it, right, in terms of the structure of the essay.
Well, there's two things that come to mind. First, there's that famous Picasso quote, right? Like, good artists borrow, great artists steal. And I always thought that it wasn't so much about there's a different process in that and more about, the stealing ideas, being unabashed about your influences and being unabashed about that people influence me and I take things from those people for my work. And there's no shame in that, because going back to what we said, if you're really a very sincere creator, you're going to undoubtedly transform it without even trying, right? And so I think that there's a real I love how he sort of breaks it down in this essay to just show that, like, I am unashamed about all these things that influence me at the end of the day. I think that's really what this is about. But the second thing I think is so interesting about this essay is that the essay in itself is this piece of art, this beautiful story that I would argue I maybe enjoyed more than the Aura novella itself, because there was something so soulful about it. The way he just sort of spoke about these experiences and these influences, there was this real emotional tug to a lot of this stuff that is especially evident in that last paragraph of the essay. And I kept thinking about the author Milan Kundera, who to me always really mixed these sort of philosophical ideas and these emotionally engaging stories in really rich ways. I had just reread the novel Immortality recently, and I was just so struck by the richness of the intersection of these kind of big philosophical ideas and then these stories that really had had an emotional core. And I think that Fuentes does this really well in this essay, and I think that's why I felt it was much more appealing to me as a piece of work than Aura itself.
So there's also this thing that he lays out that I kind of want to talk about, which I feel is very, very present in a lot of other Fuentes, but just how he uses time. And specifically, he references a couple things. One is the young woman in Paris, but then there's, towards the end of the essay, he first being at a dinner party with a woman that he saw perform many years prior, and then he sees her now. And he says that this is kind of the crux of what cracked Aura for him, and I'll read a part of it. In that instant, I discovered the true origin of Aura, its anecdotal origin, if you will, but also its origin in desire, since desire is the port of embarkation as well as the final destiny of this novella. I had heard Maria Callas sing La Traviata in Mexico City when she and I were more or less the same age, 20 years old perhaps, and now we were meeting almost 30 years later, and I was looking at a woman I had known before, but she saw in me a man she had just met that evening. She could not compare me to myself. I could, myself and her. And I think that is basically tying together. He mentions combining the old woman and Aura together in the novella as a means of sort of combining the characters of Dickens, Pushkin, Henry James. But then he also uses this personal insight into like when it all clicked for him. And I think this idea of characters existing in different times but being the same character and transitioning between selves or transitioning in this sort of somewhat bending of realistic chronological patterns, if you will, that to me shows up across a lot of Fuentes. And so I really like that. A lot of authors, I feel like when they refer to their early writings, they're almost trashing it in a way. They're saying like, oh man, I hadn't figured this out. This is naive. This is amateur. But Fuentes is actually laying out this concept that he spent a lot of his writing career trying to refine and figure out. And so that to me is one of the most attractive things about this essay outside of the allusions that, if I'm being honest, have passed over my head in many different ways. But just showing that this this novella early on in his career was really a seed to where he took a lot of his other writing. I thought was really valuable in trying to, descend into understanding some Fuentes.
So what's the timeline between Aura and the main book club selection?
I believe Death of Artemio Cruz was written in the 60s.
62, I think.
So I think Aura came just a little bit before it.
Okay.
And then kind of his masterwork, the big old Terra Nostra, was in the 70s. And so I am really excited to get into Death of Artemio Cruz to see where it fits between those two, because it's supposed to rely on a lot of the same techniques and same, I hear this thing of like cinematic influence and how he like lays things out. But this, just the concept of bending time and characters and just individual arcs is really something that I think like defines him as a whole.
Okay. So speaking of bending time, I kind of want to ask you a question that brings in a little bit of literary theory. And this is whether or not, as a reader, we and you are influenced by authorial intent. So like what the author intended to do, whether stated or not stated. Like if you read a biography or whatever, how does that influence your reading of the author's book? Should it? And did reading this article make you think differently about Aura? Did it make you appreciate it more or not? And should that have an influence?
Yeah, I mean, I know that in the selections, when we start to read things in this club, I tend to not want to learn a lot about the author and the history because I want to experience the art cold. That being said, I think that, reading this essay has definitely enriched me in terms of, if not maybe wanting to reread Aura again or maybe even think more of it, I certainly come to appreciate it a little bit more in the scope of, what Fuentes has laid out in this essay. And so, one of the examples that I think of when I was in school, I think in college, I had a teacher who, we would read works, and he was very much a historian more than a literature professor. And so he was very interested in the context and the authorial intent. And even though it wasn't always illuminating, it certainly added to it. The author that I think of is E.M. Forster, and how much we learned about E.M. Forster as a person and the context in which he was writing, for me, really gave his books like A Passage to India and Howard's End a lot more weight, just because that context of, where he lived and his repressed homosexuality was a huge part of it. I think, for me, added a little bit to my understanding of the stories. Did it elevate them more as pieces of art? I think that's the big question. Does, learning more elevate the art, or that understanding elevate our perception of it as a piece of art? I don't know. It's a question that is certainly going through my head right now.
And not just perception, but interpretation. Like, how does it affect or influence how you interpret a book? Like, what its meaning is, what it's trying to do. I know, Nick, you read some biography in preparation for book club stuff, right?
Right.
So do you find that it has a direct influence in how you read the work?
Yeah, I think personally I'm 100% down with trying to understand authorial intent and also just historical context, really anything that sort of can open up the view into what was trying to be accomplished. And I think the reason for that is, if I'm kind of like backtracking into like why do I read in the first place? I think fiction to me is a vehicle for truth in a way, as like cliche as that is like fiction can be more true than nonfiction, because since it has this layer of being made up, you can attack things in a way that aren't necessarily available if you were writing it from an individual perspective of somebody that already exists, i.e. yourself. So that layer of fiction actually frees up the room to go at a lot of ideas, whether they're personal, whether they're historical, whether there's political intent. Like that layer can be very convenient, and I'm going to get even farther off the path. But different types of narrators is one of the best parts of fiction, right? And so if I tie that back into, the topic here is, why is somebody writing something, and do they want to tell us why they're writing it, and tell us how they got there, and tell us the influence, and tell us the idea that they're picking apart? That to me always just like reinvigorates things. Yeah. I love going back into the work. I love trying to read other works by the same author, and just seeing how once you've kind of been tipped off to some of these extra details, a lot of times I find that it clears up what the author was trying to do. And so that to me is valuable. I don't think it ruins the work itself. I think it enhances it.
Now, let me ask you another hypothetical question here, both of you. So imagine no book club, no article explaining how he wrote the book. You pick up a blank book, no cover, nothing. It's just the text of Aura. What do you think of it? Do you finish it? Do you sit down and read it?
I would read it. I think one of the successes of Aura is that it is a highly literate, highly readable story. But what's interesting is I think that my appreciation of it would only have been enriched by what we are doing now. And so that makes a good argument for what Nick is saying. At the same time, if we go back to this idea of, Roland Barthes, the death of the author.
The text alone has meaning.
Yeah, the text alone, it's the birth of the reader. There's a lot of power in that for me too, because I go to fiction not to sort of piece together this stuff, but I go to fiction more because it forces me to stop and reflect on things. It makes me ask questions of myself and our world rather than providing easy answers. And to me, that's always been the prime mover for me in terms of reading fiction. It stops me. It forces me to ask questions of things that maybe in my everyday life, especially as a designer where we're always being posited as these problem solvers, to actually ask questions and reflect on things rather than just, going through the normal day and not thinking any more expansively about, human existence to get big. And so there's part of me that thinks that, this birth of the reader, stripping away the author and really kind of plugging myself into it and thinking about how it, reflects me and my world is very powerful too. And maybe not learning anything more about the author allows me to get a lot more out of it because it doesn't dissuade me or point me in another direction that maybe I personally don't want to go. That's very selfish, but...
So this is all about you right now.
Yeah, dude.
I totally agree with you. I don't know what it is, but I just love tracing connections between things. And the second Fuentes he drops this bomb right at the end where he's just talking about who the you is in Aura. And so he says, Felipe Montero, of course, is not you. You are you. Felipe Montero is only the author of Terra Nostra. And so I remember reading that, and I think we were all together when we actually read that line out loud. We're like, wait, what? What is he talking about? And then I went back and I remembered the quote that David read in the prior podcast. So I'll just read this again. I'm just going to be the quote reader this episode. You don't look at your watch again, that useless object tediously measuring time in accordance with human vanity, those little hands marking out the long hours that were invented to disguise the real passage of time, which races with a mortal and insolent swiftness no clock could ever measure, a life, a century, 50 years. You can't imagine those lying measurements any longer. You can't hold that bodiless dust within your hands. And so that goes back into the whole Fuentes time thing. And so I actually tried to recomb through Terra Nostra to figure out, it's like, oh my God, there's 40 people named Felipe in Terra Nostra, by the way. It's the recurring theme, and it stretches from the 1500s up to 1999. So I went back and I realized there's actually a chapter in Terra Nostra that converts over to the second person. I remember reading it being like, what is the point of that? What is he doing? And so then there's this paragraph towards the end of the book. It says, you believe that time always advances, that all is future. You want a future. You cannot imagine yourself without it. You do not want to provide any opportunity to those of us who require that time disintegrate and then retrace its steps until it comes to the privileged moment of love, and there only there, stop forever. And that to me is like a direct echo of that quote from Aura and the whole concept, and the fact that he's sort of doing a literary callback to his own work in the second person. And then there's also the overlap of the historical stuff where this guy in this novel of Terra Nostra, where it cycles through many different centuries, is also overlapping and sort of encompassing the time period that Aura references. I just love that, 15, 20 years later, as he's writing this other work, that he's continuing the idea that he started out as a fairly young man, because that idea is so strong and he wants to kind of reiterate on it and refine it and stuff like that. So that's my mini dissertation on just, I'm into it. Like it's cool. He's just working on it forever.
That's your engineering brain at work here in our book club.
Yeah, I don't really actually know anything about English or literature. Sorry, guys.
We can even make a connection back to Milan Kundera that Eric likes, and his The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which spends a lot of time talking about Nietzsche's The Eternal Return. I don't know if you guys...
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. Good pull, David.
What you just read reminded me of that idea of this man, Felipe, just sort of, I guess, living the same life or recycling his existence through time.
Well, the magic of this essay for me sort of is that it's right in the middle of what we're talking about, right? There's this, you could go at this essay in a very structural, formal engineering way, the way he, breaks it down to this 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 kind of structure. There's these allusions that he's talking about that you could easily get very sort of scientific about in terms of trying to trace those back to the Aura novella. But at the same time, the way he's told the story, there's such an emotional heart to it, right? And that last paragraph where he starts with, hey, I'm in this room and this beautiful woman's walking through. And at first, I remember when I was reading the book, I was like, oh, this is a little creepy, at the beginning. And then at the end where he drops the bomb that like 20 years later, this woman took her life. That's why I love this essay so much, is that it straddles that line between getting into the mechanics of writing and how it works, but then also this idea that there has to be this emotional core at it too for it to work. And this essay just really nails that for me. And that's why I think it goes so far beyond this idea of just, to me, it's a Trojan horse of so many things. Like, it's a very banal title. I think it's, How I Wrote One of My Books.
Yeah, I think it exists in multiple different titles because it is so banal.
And it becomes this so much bigger.
Yeah, it's more than just the anxiety or the lack of anxiety in this case of influence. It's how does that influence when paired up with your personal experience, which is why I like what both of you mentioned, the ties that he has to these people that he meets in daily life, how they open things up for him. They open things up and make the connections. They help him make the allusions that are there and present because of his history. They almost make the references and the influence conscious to him.
Yeah.
Yeah, the drift of time in this to go back to what Nick was talking about is really great too. I mean, I kept thinking about, I don't know if any of you guys have read some of W.G. Sebald's books and the way that they're these travel logs that become these sort of triggers for reflection on whether his own life or these bigger historical things related to Germany. But I thought a lot about that concept of vertigo that Sebald talks about in I think it was his first book, Vertigo, this sort of feeling that when you begin to, when you're in a place or you're traveling or you're just, sitting there and there are these certain things that trigger other memories or other ideas for creation, I really saw a connection between this essay and some of the stuff in those books too. And it's doing exactly what Fuentes is doing, right? He's talking about how great artists make connections between things, right? And then form them into their own little structure of something new. And that's why the more we talk about this, the more I'm like, this is a really rich piece of work.
He's showing you his process, and it's already just like tipping off your own process and kind of inspiring you to do the same. And David, you mentioned the eternal return concept, and I love that Fuentes' last book, which is on my shelf, I have not made it to, but it's actually It's called Nietzsche on His Balcony, and it's just a conversation between Fuentes and Nietzsche coming back for a day. And it's kind of funny to me that this first concept of aura and something that he's kind of worked on his whole career. His last book is just like, I'm just going to write a book where I'm just talking to Nietzsche. We'll just throw this out there. And so I don't know. I love that. The more we talk, we're like, oh yeah, it makes me think of this, it makes me think of that. And I've tried to find some recordings of Fuentes talking, and if you just listen to the guy, he's so inspiring in just like an ideas and an intellect kind of way that it's just like he just can't keep it down. And these things are all just churning in his head. And the more I tie that back as hearing his speaking voice, it also like makes these things more energetic and gives them depth. And I appreciate him as a guy who just seems infinitely curious.
I have a question for Nick, actually, since you've read a lot of his work already. Is he sort of, to you, an author that's like a Philip Roth or a Tom Waits, whereas the longer, his career went along, the more he threw off certain, creative chains? I think a lot of what happens when we often see artists who really like flame really, hot and bright in the beginning, and then they sort of taper off. And then you have these other rare artists that sort of just get crazier and more expansive as they go along. And do you think Fuentes is one of these kinds of authors to you?
I think
from what you know?
Yeah, my slot of this, having read maybe like a half a dozen books of his, trying to space them out over his career, is that I think he allowed humor and wit to come into play a lot more as he got older. That to me is kind of showcasing the artist as, a lot of us, like when we're younger, and I guess I'm still in that category, sort of struggle with like, oh, we have to make some serious art. We need to show that we have like these ideas and they're great and they're brilliant. And we can't laugh about it at all. We got to play our music with a serious face. There's definitely some humor and wit in some of his earlier stuff. But I read Christopher Unborn, and it's just, honestly, it reads like a Pynchon novel to me. And I know people are sort of on the fence about Pynchon all over the place, but like I
fell off it.
Yeah.
I'm sort of with David.
Totally fine. I'm on that fence forever. It's okay. But like just the amount of like poking fun at everything while also just tying back in this like constant list of allusions and influences. It just shows to me an author that's still having fun. And I think in his earlier days, he was definitely having fun, but maybe was very into this serious face. And then kind of, I don't know, I always just love the older fuck it mentality. Like, I've been doing this for a while. I'm still great at it, but like, I'm just going to have a good time.
Not giving a shit what people think.
Yeah.
Just going for it.
And so, I don't know, it makes me, I really am going to just continue to be reading his stuff, like in parallel with other things, because he's really inspired me from a writing style, but also just from that curiosity. I think I just love that in an author.
That makes me excited for the main selection.
Yeah, it's supposed to be a good time.
Let's make it one.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Join us next time as we continue discussing Carlos Fuentes. Find us on Facebook at Books of Some Substance, on Twitter and Instagram at Books O Substance. And you can check out our website, booksofsomesubstance.com, for news and information about upcoming reads, cool artwork, and our imprint, which currently holds Nick's novella, Power Volume. Peace.
Yo, are you guys into art? Have you had some before?